The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it.
This is Dane Wigington with GeoEngineeringWatch.org radio with Global Alert News for Saturday, December 26th, 2015. Another week of events folding around the globe that, especially this time of year, so many people are willingly unaware of. No one wants to think about what's happening that may soon affect their future. And especially around the holidays, this is always the case, and media and the power structure do their best to keep us completely distracted to such a degree that it's hard to even call it civilization when we see, as I showed in the Global Alert News, or a post on GeoEngineeringWatch.org several weeks ago, the stampede of shoppers on Black Friday that looked like riots inside of Walmart. That's what our society has become. Nobody cares that the biosphere is collapsing, that there's wars raging at ever higher levels around the globe. It's just simply, let's move from one distraction to the next, to the next. And people think that they're secure in this. C.S. Lewis said, "You know that security is a mortal's greatest enemy." The notion of security, that people think they're secure if they just have a health care plan and a retirement account, that everything will go safe and sound for them no matter what. It's all carved in stone if they have these sorts of mechanisms of modern society in place. The only security that any of us have ever is between the space of our own ears. It's the perception that our will belongs to us alone, and whatever happens on the outside that we can't control, how we choose to look at those circumstances is the only true security that any of us have. This broadcast on KQMS is sent throughout Northern California. I always like to express my gratitude to KQMS for allowing this show. It's a commercial-free show that we pay for out of pocket so that we don't diminish the message or shorten the amount of time necessary to get the message out. Another quote from Marcus Aurelius. He was really the only sane Roman emperor that existed in times of great trial and tribulation throughout the long history of Rome. Marcus Aurelius said, he was a Stoic philosopher, by the way, and much of that wisdom is so applicable today. It's so incredibly applicable. If someone is able to show me that what I think or do is not right, I will happily change, for I seek the truth by which no one was ever truly harmed. It is the person who continues in his self-deception and ignorance who is harmed. How true is that for what we face today? How many people want to continue in their self-deception, don't want to face the truth, want to cling to their ideologies, don't want facts because they've already made up their minds? That's why we're in the position we're in. That's how things get as bad as they get. The Kennedy speech at the lead into this show should have been a warning that had been heeded by society, but too many distractions again. Things like the Black Friday shopping day, when everybody is concerned about more material acquisitions and not about the correct use of their own will or the priorities that they need to adopt and pursue in order to protect the future of their children. Not much has changed in regard to human behavior. I'll get on to the news and so forth in a moment, but this Stoic philosophy, I was fortunate to have this come in my path when I was 13, 14 years old. And it's certainly parallel to biblical texts and other great truths around the globe. Certain fundamental principles for living that our society has largely ignored. So not a lot has changed over two millennia of human history. People are behaving the same way. It's worse now, of course, because of all the material acquisitions. So on that note, what mainstream media headlines do we have this week to distract us? Just 4 of these, then I'll move on to news that we do need to hear. But I just want to make the point again, as I always do, the sort of nonsense that's put out by our, quote, mainstream media, which is the only trough from which most of the public feeds for their news, which is truly sad that this is where they form their opinion of the world. So here's 4 mainstream media headlines. Bill Cosby sues supermodel. Does that matter in any context for the bigger global picture, for the future of our children, at all? Another headline, fans puzzled about Star Wars. Completely irrelevant in the bigger picture. While ecosystems are imploding and imperial wars are being waged around the globe, chaos is ensuing in about 36 countries around the globe. We're talking about Star Wars now as a headline on mainstream media. 2 more. End of car chase stuns cop. How important is that? I mean, again, this is just stuff they grab out of a hat. And finally, the Kardashian Christmas card. Just to give an example of the idiocy that's put out by our corporate media. And again, this is the primary trough from which most of the public feeds for their opinion, their perception of the world. A few short, real headlines to follow this up. And again, a lot of these news sources are very, very to the point that people don't go to. And some of these headlines, in fact, a great news source I brought up in the past is called Rice Farmer. I know that name is a little unorthodox. If you simply search Rice Farmer online, you'll come to a site that's put out by a rice farmer in Japan. No politics, no advertisement, simply categorize hard-hitting data. A recession is imminent. Of course, and this is a headline, and we see this headline in a number of places now, but it's not just a recession. That's a lie. This is not another bump in the road that's going to go away. When nature no longer provides, that's the end of the system that has been, and we are there. So when people say a recession is coming, as if you can look backward at a graph at certain recessions that come and go, and somehow that gives it a life going forward, that is not true. When ecosystems implode, that is the end of the system that was, and we are there. Another headline, UK government attempting to keep details of secret security pact with Saudi Arabia hidden from the public. Same as the US government, also in bed with Saudi Arabia. Goes way back. This is especially true with the Bush family, but also with the Obamas. Absolutely true. I highlighted in a recent show the gifts from the Saudi family to the Obamas. And the same was true with the Bushes. There's no difference. There's no difference in these political parties. People need to get that through their head. It's simply mass distraction. Just like the headlines from mainstream media I just read, it's all designed to keep people from truly understanding the gravity of what's unfolding. Keep them busy, occupied. So with Saudi Arabia, while our government and the UK government pretends to be spreading, quote, freedom and democracy around the globe, absolute nonsense. It's not about freedom and democracy. It's about empire. It's about increased power for the global elite. That's what it's about. That's what our military brothers and sisters are being used for, and I hope they wake up to that fact. Saudi Arabia, that has doubled their rate of public beheadings, by the way. Do we hear about that in our news? Never. Never on mainstream media will you hear about that, because that's where the oil's coming from. The U.S. military and their use of hydrocarbon is so extreme that they can't and won't expose or jeopardize one of their primary sources of fossil fuels to fuel the military industrial juggernaut of insanity. So we have lots of allies, just like Saddam Hussein was once an ally, and given some of the weapons he used, poison gas to kill some of the Kurds. This is all historical fact. So again, it's about who is serving the interests of the Western powers. That's who is the ally. It has nothing to do with how despotic these nations are or their leaders. It has only to do with what they can give the Western power structure. Another headline, the kind we don't see in our rose-colored lens mainstream media propaganda. Toshiba to cut 10,000 jobs. Downsize consumer electronics business. That's a big cut. How good could the economy be when they're cutting 10,000 jobs? And as I mentioned in previous weeks, again, the Baltic Dry Index, all global dry shipping, skidding to a halt, screeching to a halt. The economy is done. It's finished. It's simply a card house at this point. And that will be visible soon enough when they can't hide it any longer. And once they can't hide the fact that the paradigm we've known is over, you can expect some big shoes to drop from the power structure. They're preparing, as I've stated over and over. But these are the headlines that you won't find on mainstream media. Two final headlines here. For Caterpillar, the depression just turned 3 years. Cat hasn't had a sales increase in 36 consecutive months. The only reason these companies are even afloat is because their stocks are being purchased with printed central bank fiat money and purchased behind the scenes to artificially prop up the card house that is our stock market. Those who don't believe it, you will. Wait and see. And why do they have to prop things up so much? Because back to the security issue I mentioned at the beginning of this program, because the population feels secure if they're under the perception that their retirement accounts and so forth are all safe, as if it's carved in stone, as if somehow that's an unshakable reality. Couldn't be further from the truth. So if they let the stock market go down and all the retirement accounts that are invested in the stock market went belly up, that's the end of the perception of security, which was never there to begin with. It's all an illusion and always has been. Final headline on job cutting: City to cut 2,000 jobs starting next month. We don't see this on our news. We absolutely don't see it. What about the biosphere? Again, this is ongoing. This is directly connected to economic conditions. It's directly connected to our common future. What's happening with Earth's life support system? That's why I cover this so much. Again, how astounding is it when you have political quote-unquote debates that don't even mention the disintegrating life support systems of our planet? What kind of ridiculous society do we live in when such a travesty of a quote-unquote debate is so completely meaningless, and the issues on which our lives literally depend aren't even mentioned? Republican debate or Democratic debate, neither one mentioned climate change at all. So when we have an outbreak of tornadoes, again, this is unprecedented. The scope and scale of the outbreak that just happened because of the record heat in the eastern U.S., record-shattering heat. Temperatures of 70 degrees expected in places like New York, or occurred Christmas Eve, And we have ice storms occurring between the warm side of the quote winter storm now and the cold side of the winter storm. Since when, again, do we have a warm side and a cold side where we have temperatures that are 30 degrees above normal along much of the eastern half of the U.S., while it's predicted to snow on the Texas-Mexico border? What's wrong with this picture? What's it take to make people wake up and understand that their weather is being completely derailed, manipulated? There's huge damage done to the climate from countless sources, but the scope and scale of the global weather modification is beyond true comprehension. Now, I believe the amount of records shattered is pushing something like 10,000 high-temperature records in the last 2 weeks. Those high temperatures are expected to continue, and it's not just happening in the eastern U.S. It's happening in Europe, happening in Australia, happening in other places. We have this radical, off-balance climate nightmare that's unfolding. It's just beginning. It's just beginning. This is a nonlinear equation. It's going to accelerate rapidly. But again, this is why the term climate change was implemented by the power structure in the late 90s when they truly ramped up the climate engineering insanity, because they knew they would be creating this weather whiplash, these radical swings that can only be achieved from massive climate engineering and ice nucleation. Again, it started snowing here where I live on the east side of Lake Shasta about a week ago at 46, 47 degrees. Why? Doesn't anybody ask why now, instead of it getting cold and then snowing, it starts snowing and then it gets cold? Doesn't anybody question this? It gets cold because they're chemically nucleating the moisture in the clouds. This dries up a lot of the moisture, so not that much falls. And as that nucleation process continues, it creates a cold, dense layer of air in the ground. So it gets cold after it starts snowing. How else can it go from 100 degrees to snow in one day? I'm not making that up. We documented this on GeoEngineeringWatch.org in Amarillo, Texas on May 1st, 2013. It was an all-time record high of 100 degrees on the ground, and it snowed the next day. People need to ask themselves what's going on. Now, again, in addition to the disintegrating climate system, we have disintegration of societal structure around the globe. And the Syria situation is ongoing in that regard. And I know this is being covered on mainstream media from a very twisted, tainted point of view. But we have just had information released from journalist Seymour Hersh, who's done a lot of cutting-edge exposure over several decades, that U.S. military leaders behind the scenes, without the knowledge of the administration, helped Assad with the intelligence he needed to stay in power. Now, why did they do this? Because those U.S. military leaders were trying to adhere to the oath they had taken to the Constitution of the United States and the U.S. people, and they knew that allowing Syria to disintegrate into the same mess that Libya is, which fuels ISIS for further expansion, these leaders recognized that that was not in the interest of the U.S. people. What the Obama administration is doing is completely against the interest of the U.S. population. To continue to fund, fuel, arm, and create conditions for ISIS to expand, how is that in the interest of the U.S. population? Obviously it's not, but it is for those in power, in that they can then use this ISIS excuse to clamp down everywhere they want to. Sow the seeds of fear from something that they have sown and spawned themselves. So these military leaders, again, there'll be more developing on the story. RT, Russia Today, is covering much of the story, and as are other sources. But Seymour Hersh is a very reputable journalist. And now we see that they at least recognize this sort of chaos being created in the Middle East is not in the benefit of the U.S. population, or anyone for that matter. And the Western sanctions continue against Russia, of course, as this battle heats up. We see now it's been disclosed that Turkey planned on shooting down the Russian jet. All this goes together. And why? Because Russia was slowing down the flow of oil from ISIS to Turkey, as we covered before. So with all these events, what do we see? We see as the walls close in, desperation increases. What would the U.S. do if this had happened to one of our jets from a Russian ally? What would we do? Again, the hypocrisy is so immense. And when you watch mainstream media and the kind of nonsense that they put out, our population needs to show some responsibility and look past the propaganda. What would we do if, for example, we had Russia setting up military installations in Tijuana, and we had, that kind of surrounding of our nation as NATO's doing to Russia? What would we do? I'm simply saying the American population, again, getting their information from mainstream media, has no clue on what's really going on around the world. And I'm not saying Putin doesn't have his flaws and that he's in any sense honest in many other ways. Anybody who's at the head of a country has certainly participated in a lot of things that are not honorable, if you will. But that being said, at this point, it appears Putin is the more sane part of this equation. And our mainstream media is simply trying to paint a picture of Putin and China in ways that would galvanize the American population to be willing to exchange in conflict, which is the last card left our power structure has to start a global conflict. As they're exposed, as the climate engineering is exposed, as the economic house of cards is exposed for what it is, as the tyranny is exposed, that's the last card the military-industrial has to play to start global conflict. And that's why they're poking and prodding Russia, China, and all the rest. Again, as the walls close in, there's not enough to go around. There's no more places to loot, pillage, and plunder around the planet. And when that happens, the law of the jungle will be the new standard. And when you have a massive military machine, which is the only tool left for the power structure, you can bet they'll use it. And they're already using it on all of us. Again, when we have people who believe in Fox News and CNN and MSNBC as if they're getting some sort of truth from there, these are the same organizations that don't say a word about the fact that, oh, by the way, your government is spraying toxic materials on you as part of climate modification, which is really nothing more than weather warfare, which is really nothing more than biological warfare. They're all the same. When they spray toxic elements in our skies and it's falling on us, and we know it is, we have enough lab tests to prove that, and our government is doing that, how can anybody feel that they're, in any sense, protected by our government? Our government's not there to protect us. The military is being used for tools for the power structure, again, and the U.S. population is every bit as much a victim, and that's going to increase as time goes on. And on the climate situation itself, again, this is so incredibly important because our lives depend on Earth's life support systems. If those systems cease to function, it's game over. And those systems are being radically hampered from climate engineering that should be exposed. So let's trace this back a bit to see who hid what and when. Here's a report from PBS Frontline. The title is A Missing Report on ExxonMobil and Climate Change. And again, I stress, who are the players behind climate engineering, which is weather warfare and biological warfare? The military-industrial complex, the fossil fuel industry on which they depend. That's important to understand that. So climate engineering has been used for many decades, as I just posted at geoengineeringwatch.org under the recent column, a timeline on what has happened in the Arctic, what part geoengineering played in that, and how much the power structure has tried to hide the magnitude of what was unfolding for as long as possible in order to keep business as usual, keep their juggernaut of insanity expanding like a cancer, and to keep the reality of what was coming from public view. So as we plug ExxonMobil into this, a missing report on climate change. This is directly from PBS. Exxon's engagement with the emerging science of climate change. The story spans 4 decades and is based on primary sources, including internal company files dating back to the late 1970s, interviews with former company employees, and other evidence, much of which is being published here for the first time. The PBS report continues. It describes how Exxon conducted cutting-edge climate research decades ago and then, without revealing all that it had learned, worked at the forefront of climate denial, manufacturing doubt about the scientific consensus that its own scientists had confirmed. How hard is this to figure out? Who would want the American population to not understand the damage that was being done to the planet? The fossil fuel industry and the military-industrial complex. We're talking about one of the greatest polluters on the planet, the U.S. military. I'll get to that in a few moments. But of course they're going to want to hide the fact that the fuel on which their machine depends is destroying the planet. And how many people today have bought the completely spun disinformation? Yes, we all, again, love to hate Al Gore. I've been over that a million times. Gore is a part of the problem. How could he claim to fight climate change when he owns stock in the very companies creating it? He's the epitome of hypocrisy as well. But people have to look past that. Who's at the core of this? Who's trying to hide the data? And the report I posted at geoengineeringwatch.org shows historical photographs, which we located on the Naval Archives, of U.S. submarines surfaced at the North Pole in open water in March of 1959. Now, what does that mean exactly? The U.S. military knew what was happening to the climate for a very long time, and these programs of climate engineering were ramped up right after World War II because they knew the Arctic was already melting, even then. In the initial decades of climate engineering did actually, very toxically and destructively, but it stayed off some of the ice disintegration for a fairly long time at great cost to the planet overall. At great cost. There's nothing good in climate engineering. But if you look at the graphs, look at the article that I posted on geoengineeringwatch.org, piece those dots together, and you'll see a picture that makes clear the military-industrial complex knew what was coming the entire time. So did the oil companies. They knew much sooner than this PBS report would indicate. And they simply did everything they could at the ultimate cost of destroying Earth's life support systems to keep business as usual for as long as they could. Another headline, ExxonMobil, Peabody Coal, lobbying for a bill preventing climate change accounting in U.S. trade deals. Again, look behind the scenes. People have been trained to believe that everybody in the climate science community is exaggerating the degree of threat we face from a disintegrating climate. Forget all sources of information. Look for yourself. Look for yourself what's happening around the globe. We have forests flaming all over the planet. We have sea levels rising. We have villages toppling into the ocean in the Arctic Circle. Look at the frontline data and you don't need to believe anyone then. Watch Chasing Ice. I challenge anybody to spend $2 and watch Chasing Ice. People will spend $100, $200 for a ticket to a football game. But they won't spend $2 to watch a film that's frontline data that can't be argued with, that can't be spun, to show them what's really happening with the life support systems on the planet that their children depend on for survival. So, again, with this headline, ExxonMobil, Peabody Coal lobbying for a bill preventing climate change accounting in U.S. trade deals. This report continues. The day before global leaders and diplomats passed a climate change deal in Paris at the United Nations Climate Summit, the U.S. House of Representatives, in a 256 to 158 vote, authorized the final text of a bill that has a provision preventing climate change to be accounted for in all U.S. trade deals going forward. No matter what smoke and mirrors have been put up, and how many people have taken that bait to think that they are trying to enforce something to restrict industry and the military-industrial complex and the use of fossil fuels, the exact opposite is true. The exact opposite. So many people so confused about this, and that's not by accident. Not by accident. The more the power structure creates infighting, confusion, deception, then nobody really understands, or very few understands coherently what's really going on, because they're not looking at data. And that's the core of the problem. So many people have so many opinions that they have gotten from a headline or what so-and-so said, or people need to look for themselves. Look at the front line data from the ground yourself. Look at reports like this. That is the bottom line. They are trying to make sure that there is no enforcement of any provisions that would slow down the current system of environmental destruction. This report continues. That bill, the, quote, Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act of 2015, now may proceed for a full floor votes in both the House and the Senate after its conference report was agreed upon. The bill has received heavy fossil fuel industry support. Why is that a surprise? Who has the most money in the world? The military-industrial complex and the fossil fuel industry. That's why the system is what it is. And all these other events of distraction, like the Paris Conference, the Copenhagen Climate Conference, the Cancun Climate Conference, all simply distractions, period. This is the bottom line. These companies are not about to change direction or alter their way of doing business until they can no longer do so, until the planet implodes, until society collapses. That's the mentality we're dealing with. So, the final sentence in this report. The language in the bill originally dictated that trade agreements do not require changes to U.S. law or obligate the United States with respect to global warming or climate change. In other words, there is no enforcement that the U.S. has to follow that have to in any way acknowledge or deal with the disintegrating climate. Period. Now, to add to this, again, this is a report from Project Censored. Who's the worst polluter on the planet? This headline reads, the U.S. Department of Defense is the worst polluter on planet Earth. From this report, the U.S. military is responsible for the most egregious and widespread pollution of the planet. Yet this information and accompanying documentation goes almost entirely unreported. In spite of the evidence, the environmental impact of the U.S. military goes largely unaddressed, even by environmental organizations. It was not the focus of any discussions, proposed restrictions at the UN Climate Change Conference. Why not? Why not? People need to consider this. They think that something completely different is going on at these conferences and are off going such a completely incorrect direction on what's really happening there. The real goal of these conferences is to make certain segments of society believe that something is being done to slow down the destruction of the planet when the exact opposite is true. The exact opposite. Those with the power and control have absolutely no interest in changing their method of conduct. They have no interest in that. And these kinds of realities prove it. Finishing this report about the U.S. military pollution, this impact includes uninhibited use of fossil fuels, massive creation of greenhouse gases, and extensive release of radioactive and chemical contaminants into the air, water, and soil. This is our military, which I've spoken about in the past, using depleted uranium, poisoning our own soldiers. Again, I stress, those who believe that our power structure with their Navy commercials and their U.S. Army commercials that we see, in fact, a lot on Weather Channel. By the way, Weather Channel, their main sponsor, based on the amount of commercials shown by the U.S. military, is the U.S. military. No surprise, because Weather Channel, one of their main functions is to try to hide the tracks of the massive climate engineering that's going on. But when we see these commercials that make it sound like the U.S. military is some force for the common good that's preserving the future for your children, it couldn't be further from the truth. Couldn't be further from the truth. And I challenge, as I always have, our brothers and sisters in the military, who I know there's a lot of great men and women in the military, but if you're staying asleep at the wheel, if you're blindly following orders, if you're not examining what you're doing and what it's doing to the rest of the planet and your own population, then you have abandoned your oath to protect your citizens and the Constitution from all threats, foreign and domestic. If you're not doing what I just described, if you're not looking around and examining what you're a part of, then you have broken your oath. And I challenge you to take a good look around and uphold your oath, to not follow orders that are harmful to your fellow citizens and the rest of the people on the planet. And this is what it's about. Again, protecting the military-industrial complex from any restriction whatsoever. They can do whatever they want. They can use depleted uranium, as I just described, which caused Gulf War syndrome on our soldiers in the first Gulf War. About 200,000 U.S. servicemen sickened from that. I know a lot about that issue. I actually brought one of the main spokesmen for depleted uranium, Dennis Kine. I brought him to Reading twice. Reading, who I thought, a lot of patriotic people in Reading, right? They would want to hear from a 15-year Marine medic, veteran, from a family of veterans, coming to Reading to speak about depleted uranium and what it was doing to our own troops. Who showed up at that meeting? I paid for it out of my pocket, twice. A handful of people showed up. I guess for most people it's a lot easier to slap a sticker on your bumper that says, support our troops, than to actually show up somewhere at a meeting and actually support the troops in reality. Because few people do that. I worked as a volunteer rehabbing NAM vets that were horribly disfigured. Vietnam, a war that never needed to happen, that was started from a false flag. I spent my time, I didn't just put a bumper sticker on my car, I actually worked with some of these disfigured men, absolutely broke my heart. I had great reverence for them, for what they gave, for the right motives, even though those in power abused their goodwill. I gave to DAV, I've given to VFW, It takes a lot more to support our troops than just to slap a sticker on your bumper. That's not enough. Back to the U.S. military and their pollution and this report from Project Center. The U.S. military is one of the world's fastest growing sources of greenhouse gas pollution. If commercial aviation were also considered a country, it would rank 7th after Germany in terms of carbon emissions. So we have the U.S. military, massive source of greenhouse pollution that is completely unregulated, and we have the commercial aviation industry, completely unregulated. So why was this massive source in the case of aviation, which we know also includes climate engineering, and they can eliminate anything from the equation they want, and they do, and the public misses this, and the environmental groups that are supposed to care, supposed to be watching over what's happening, they seem to completely ignore. Conveniently, environmental groups like 350.org, one of the main global warming environmental groups, completely ignores the fact that geoengineering is going on in our skies, the single greatest climate disrupting factor of all, not the only source of damage. Anybody who thinks that is in total denial. We have decimated the planet. Geoengineering is not the only source of that decimation, but mathematically, in regard to the climate, it's likely the greatest source of climate disruption, and it's completely ignored by environmental groups like 350.org, NRDC, Sierra Club, Greenpeace. I could go on and on and on. Why? Who's paying these people? Well, let's take one example. Bill McGibbon for 350.org. He receives money from the Rockefeller Foundation. What a surprise that he won't talk about climate engineering. What a surprise that he's really not talking about the fact that at the Paris conference, aviation was completely eliminated from the climate talks. No wonder he won't talk about it. It would be bad for his bottom line, wouldn't it? The same is true for all these other environmental organizations. The epitome of hypocrisy. They should bow their heads in shame as they are ignoring the true elephants in the room. Not that CO2 is not a problem, methane's a problem, a lot of other sources of pollution. Again, the nuclear situation, these are all huge problems. But what kind of hypocrisy do we have when the quote-unquote environmental groups ignore all these problems? Now, this is what we have for more distraction, again, from the military-industrial complex, mainstream media, and NASA. So while all this is going on, climate engineering sacking the planet, we have the military dumping radioactive material into the oceans for practice, using radioactive ammunition for practice off the U.S. West Coast and all over the globe, in the Middle East and so forth. What do we have from NASA now? Here's a headline from this week. NASA wants to grow potatoes on Mars. I want to understand, again, people who aren't looking past these headlines don't want a clue. They don't want a clue. This report continues. In Ridley Scott's science fiction drama, The Martian, Matt Damon's character plays a botanist who discovers how to grow potatoes on the red planet. Now, scientists are conducting an experiment that will bring them a step closer to making that a reality. NASA and the Peru-based International Potato Center, where did that come from, will start cultivating potatoes in Mars-like conditions on Earth, with the hope of eventually building a controlled dome on Mars capable of farming the ancient crop. Why would we be trying to do this on another planet while at the same time destroying our own planet that once was very hospitable? And the notion that they're going to grow potatoes on Mars, this is just theater. It's total theater, designed to make people think that technology will always fix everything. Absolute nonsense. Another major headline, again, that I want to keep repeating because it's a huge, huge red flag as to the denial of the science and environmental community on the geoengineering elephant in the room. Headline from Christian Science Monitor: Decline of wild bees imperils U.S. crops. This report continues. Washington, wild bees, crucial pollinators for many crops, are on the decline in some of the main agricultural regions of the United States, according to scientists who produced the first national map of bee populations. They identified numerous trouble spots. The researchers on Monday cited 139 countries as especially worrisome, with wild bee numbers decreasing. Now, does it take a team of scientists to see this? Anybody that is in the slightest bit aware of their environment sees the bees are all but gone. They're all but gone. But will these people examine the climate engineering factor, even though we now have peer-reviewed study to say the bees are packed full of aluminum? Absolutely packed. Again, this is exactly what we have told, what I personally have told some of the head bee tenders in the country, some of the main bee people, very highly degreed people, that there was a much bigger issue than the pesticides because the bees were just as dead 1,000 miles into the wilderness. There had to be a bigger issue. There was. We have peer-reviewed study now that they're packed full of aluminum. Does anybody even ask where this metal's coming from? We have lab tests to prove it was coming down. We've known it was coming down. It's in all of us. And yet environmental groups and even bee people ignore reality. They ignore it. We're right back to the quote at the beginning of this show from Marcus Aurelius about people's willingness to ignore the truth. I repeat that quote from 2,000 years ago, 1,900 years ago. If someone is able to show me that what I think or do is not right, I will happily change, for I seek the truth by which no one was ever truly harmed. It is the person who continues in his self-deception and ignorance who is harmed. But when we have a society that continues in that self-deception and ignorance, we are all harmed. All of us, irreparably. And the path we're on right now leads to certain mathematical global extinction. How hard is this to see? I'm just asking the question, how hard is it to see? We have pollinators disappearing. We know what Einstein said about that. We know what he said about how long the human race would last once the bees are gone, and the bees are just about gone. Even the native bees. We used to, where I live, have some bumblebees after the honeybees had mostly disappeared. Not seeing those now. We have meat wasps that live underground that have survived a little bit longer. Not seeing those either. Haven't seen a frog in 6 months. The forest is silent. Absolutely silent. The occasional bird flies by. I don't really see much bear scat in the woods anymore. Used to have bears all over here. There's a few around, but not many. Not much for them to eat. Very few acorns this year. Very few. So, where do we go? When nature can't survive in the environment, how are we to survive? I've heard people tell me that if things get bad, they'll survive in the forest. What absolute nonsense that is. I've grown up to a large degree in wilderness areas, and I have a great deal of wilderness around my home that was thriving 10 years ago. There's no chance I could survive there. And I know the forest quite well. If the animals can't survive, how can we survive? People are living in a total delusion, absolute delusion. We have now some countries pushing back against some things, and that's of help. We have a headline here, Venezuela passes national anti-GMO and anti-patent seed law. That's a step in the right direction, but only a step. And again, if we continue to be assaulted from the sky, if the soils continue to be sterilized with the fallout from climate engineering, the ozone layer shredded, and again, excessive UV levels decimate crop production, and photosynthesis stops at 104 degrees, and the planet is warming radically fast. And it doesn't go along normally until 104 degrees and just stop. It tapers off and stops completely at 104 degrees. So when we have conditions on the planet where you can't grow your own food, then not much else matters, does it? And how many people are ignoring this fact? You hear people talk about, well, I'll just go off the grid and plant a garden and live happily ever after. That's not reality. A lot of people that have that notion don't want to engage in the fight for the common good. They just simply want to poke their head in the sand. That's not going to help us. It's good to see Venezuela taking these kinds of steps. We know Russia has banned all the GMO. That's a good step forward. But if we don't stop other things that are decimating our planet, starting with climate engineering, again, nothing else will matter. From this report on Venezuela, Venezuela's National Assembly has approved a draft seed law which provides that the state shall promote sustainable agriculture as the strategic basis for food security. The rule seeks to consolidate national food sovereignty, regulate the production of hybrid seed, and reject the production and distribution and import of GM seeds. Now, when you go into Home Depot and you have a whole rack of seeds that are hybrid, that you can't gain new seeds from whatever you plant, they won't grow again. How ridiculous is that? What kind of society would allow that to happen? That you have to buy seeds from a biotech company every year in order to continue your sustenance. Why would society allow that to happen? Because people don't want to know. Again, they want to remain in their self-deception. And now we're in a very dark corner, a very dark corner. If we go to the overall climate situation and things that a lot of people don't even consider in the equation, here's another headline that many probably haven't considered. Groundwater depletion adding to global sea level rise. When you pump the water out of the ground and you scatter it over the surface of the planet and it evaporates and goes into the atmosphere and comes down somewhere else, it actually adds to sea level rise on top of everything else. In addition to eliminating any chance of long-term irrigation, because fields all over the globe are going dry. Anybody who've looked at some of the irrigation that's happened in Saudi Arabia, for example, large circular fields that are pumped from a central well with a big spinning irrigation system to make a circular irrigated field. Those fields are now furrowed. They're dead because there's no more water below those fields. People think water simply recharges in aquifers. In most cases, this is not true. This is ancient water in so many aquifers left over from the Ice Age. Literally, they are not recharge zones. And we're pumping them out. And it ends up actually adding to sea level rise. From this report, Palm Springs, California, increasing amounts of water being depleted from the world's aquifers, and scientists have estimated that a large portion of the water ends up flowing into the oceans. Where else could it go? So much groundwater is being pumped from wells that researchers say it's contributing significantly to global sea level rise. Hydrologists have calculated the amount of groundwater depleted annually since 1900, and their findings are striking when plotted on a chart. Their figures show depletion occurring at an accelerating pace, which in turn is pushing the levels of the oceans higher. The quickening rate of global depletion adds an alarming dimension to scientists' finding based on satellite measurements that reveal widespread declines in aquifers around the world. And as the water flows off the continents, it is adding to the problem of rising seas and glaciers and ice sheets due to global warming. Yes, global warming is real. If you don't believe it, you're not looking at frontline data. Period. You're not. I'm not asking anybody to believe me, as I said earlier. Look at frontline data. Watch the types of films I mentioned earlier. Chasing Ice. Look at the amount of records being set around the globe. Look at the forest burning to the ground. Forests don't burn down around the globe because the planet is cooling. Some areas are losing 600 to 700% more forest to forest fires than they have historically. Canada, for one. Siberia, for another. They're burning down around the globe. Formerly frozen methane deposits don't thaw and release from getting colder. It's from getting warmer. That's what thaws the methane. Look at the frontline data. The final sentence from this report. If we want to understand current sea level rise, which we need to understand to better predict future sea level rise, we have to take into account this groundwater contribution. That's just one more straw on the camel's back. And it is happening. Miami and other locations are pumping out every high tide. I mean, Miami is spending hundreds of millions of dollars right now trying to hide this problem. They're not going to be able to hide it for much longer, period. So the more we understand what's really happening with the climate, why is it so important, especially for those trying to fight geoengineering? Why is it so important to understand, yes, the climate is not just warming, it's not just global warming, we're in a climate shift. We're in a climate shift, an abrupt climate shift. It's happening now. Why is it important to understand that so that the climate science community does not try to stay as far away from the anti-geoengineering community as possible because of a very incorrect conclusion that we see a lot of even independent news sites talking about right now. I see this all the time. A ridiculous article I just saw from an independent news site that tried to make the point that pollution is actually good for the planet, cooling the planet. Who would say that? Except somebody who's perhaps receiving funding from the fossil fuel industry. Because this article, and some articles from mainstream sources like NASA, have made the point that volcanic eruptions and particulates in the atmosphere do have a short-term cooling effect, something we've always stated the data supported on Geoengineering Watch, it comes at the cost of a worsened overall long-term warming. Because those particulates shred ozone, the greenhouse gases build up below that. It's a complex situation. It's complex. But when we see independent news sites putting out a message that talks about how wonderful particulates are in the atmosphere and that it actually cools the planet when the planet's not cooling, and with no mention whatsoever in this recent article about the geoengineering spraying, which the same news site claims to be against. What kind of hypocrisy is that? It's the same hypocrisy that we see with the environmental groups that won't admit to the geoengineering elephant in the room. Same hypocrisy. It's up to all of us to have a correct compass heading. If we're going to fight effectively in a battle, you have to know what the facts are. And if you're not looking for the facts and you're marching into the battle with an impression or a conclusion that you got from a headline or something you heard from someone else or in previous years, and you're not looking at frontline current data, then you're marching into the battle with a completely incorrect perspective. Get your compass heading straight. On that note, retired U.S. Army Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, very honorable man. I encourage people to look this up online and see what he just had to say. With everything I just went over, the ship is sinking. This is his quote. U.S. retired Army Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson tells Abby Martin, the ship is sinking, adding that today the purpose of the U.S. foreign policy, again this is from a former Army Colonel, he says, today the purpose of the U.S. foreign policy is to support the complex that we have created in the national security state that is fueled, funded, and powered by interminable war, perpetual war. This is directly from a U.S. Army Colonel. He continues, the report continues, the former National Security Advisor to the Reagan administration, who spent years as an Assistant Secretary of State to Colin Powell during both Bush administrations, reflects on the sad but honest reflection of what America has become as it exposes the unfixable corruption inside the establishment and the corporate interests driving foreign policy. Corporate interests like the ExxonMobil interests I mentioned earlier. That's what's driving the power structure, period. It's never been about altruism. It's about sheer power. Why the economy is kept propped up until the last moment? To avoid panic. To make the public believe their retirement accounts again are safe and sound. It's all a grand illusion that unfortunately the vast majority of the population is desperate to buy into, as opposed to actually having the courage to face reality. Why wouldn't we be listening to people like Colonel Lawrence, who states the hard, cold facts that this whole system, our government, the military-industrial complex, is all about fueling the national security state, fueling the cabal. What will each of us do with our time as the reality we have all known unravels? And it is unraveling by the day. By the day. What will our priorities be? Will we engage in the battle for the greater good head on so that we might yet preserve some part of Earth's life support systems for the future of our children? Or will we occupy our time with endless distractions and unimportant activities? That's the society we live in at the moment. Unimportant activities that help so many people stay in denial. They feel if their friends, their peers, their family aren't worried, then why should they be worried? Nobody else is worried. So we all march together off the end of the plank, because the ship we are on is absolutely going down. Watch the Titanic again, the Leonardo DiCaprio version of the Titanic, and see how people behave when the ship starts going down. And that's what we face. That movie's a good metaphor for what's already starting to happen around the world, and that's going to accelerate. We don't have tomorrow. We only have today. Find out what's happening around you, around the world. Share what you learn with others. Make your voice heard in the battle for the greater good while there's yet time to make a difference. And that time is rapidly running out. Until next week, this is Dane Wigington with GeoEngineeringWatch.org.